Sonny Liston was the most feared man in boxing before Muhammad Ali existed. Even after Ali, there were people in that sport, serious people, people who had been around violence their entire lives, who believed that Sonny Liston was the most genuinely dangerous human being who had ever put on gloves. He did not frighten easily. He did not frighten at all. That was not modesty or performance. It was simply true. In 40 years of a hard life, he had encountered things that would have broken most men before breakfast, and he had walked through all of it without the expression on his face changing very much. So when Sonny Liston grabbed his manager's arm at a boxing event in Los Angeles and said 3 words, quiet, urgent, completely unlike the man who said them, everyone who witnessed it understood that something extraordinary had just happened. Those 3 words traveled through the boxing world within days, and when people heard who had caused them, they stopped being surprised. Because the man who had walked past Sonny Liston and produced those 3 words was Bruce Lee, and he hadn't even looked at him. The man who made Ali blink first. Before we get to the event, before we get to those 3 words, you need to understand what Sonny Liston actually was. Because history has been unkind to him in a specific way, he lost to Muhammad Ali twice, and those 2 losses became the thing people remembered, the dominant story, the defining fact. But that is the wrong place to start understanding Sonny Liston. Start earlier. Start with the man before Ali arrived. Sonny Liston had grown up with nothing and survived it through a combination of physical capability and absolute refusal to be diminished by anything the world put in front of him. He had been to prison. He had worked for people who operated outside the law. He had navigated a world that offered him almost nothing and taken from it what he needed with his hands. By the time he reached the heavyweight championship of the world, he had absorbed more genuine hardship than most people encounter in 3 lifetimes. And none of it had made him afraid. It had made him, in the specific way that real hardship sometimes does, completely comfortable with the most extreme versions of human experience. He knocked out Floyd Patterson in 2 minutes and 6 seconds, the first time. He knocked him out again in the rematch in 2 minutes and 10 seconds. Floyd Patterson was not a bad fighter. He was a former heavyweight champion of the world. Liston dismantled him like he was clearing a table. The boxing world was terrified of Sonny Liston, not of losing to him, terrified of him, as a phenomenon, as a force, as a human being who seemed to exist at a different relationship with consequence than anyone around him. Muhammad Ali was the first person who looked at Sonny Liston and genuinely did not flinch. The first person whose body language said, "I see you, and I am not afraid." And even Ali had to work at that, had to talk himself into it, and then talk loudly enough that the talking convinced both of them. Liston had never, before that event in Los Angeles, grabbed anyone's arm and said anything in a quiet, urgent voice. The event, and the evening before anything happened. It was a boxing exhibition event in Los Angeles, late 1966, the first person who did not please. Liston, she didn't Twitter to the event. Liston the tenet of a world of being somewhat kind of evening where the sport celebrated itself. Past champions, current contenders, trainers, promoters, the whole ecosystem gathered under one roof for something that was part competition and part ceremony. Sonny Liston was there as a guest of honor. His fighting career was winding down, but his presence still commanded the specific kind of attention that physical authority commands. The way a room reorganizes itself around certain people without any announcement. He was with his manager. They had arrived early, which was unusual for Liston, who generally moved on his own schedule. They had found a spot near the back of the room where Liston preferred to stand, against a wall, able to see everything, accountable to no direction he didn't choose. He was comfortable. This was his world. These were his people. The machinery of professional boxing surrounded him, and it was familiar machinery that he had navigated for 20 years. He stood with his drink, watched the room, said occasional things to his manager in the laconic way of a man for whom silence was not uncomfortable. For the first 40 minutes of the evening, nothing unusual happened. Then, the room changed. How a room changes when Bruce Lee enters it. This has been described by enough people in enough different contexts that it is no longer possible to dismiss as mythology. When Bruce Lee entered a room, particularly a room full of people whose professional lives were organized around physical capability and the assessment of physical capability, something shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that could be pointed to and explained, but in the way the air shifts when a window is opened. Something changed that everyone present felt before they understood what they were feeling. The people who have tried to describe it most accurately land on the same territory from different directions. They say it was not threatening, it was not aggressive, it was not the specific energy of someone who wants you to know they could hurt you. That energy is common in those rooms. Everyone knows what it feels like, and everyone has calibrated their response to it over years of professional proximity. This was something different, something that did not fit the existing categories, something that the nervous system responded to before the conscious mind had any information. Bruce Lee walked in that evening and moved through the room the way he always moved, with that quality of complete presence, no part of him somewhere else, no part of him managing distance or performing ease, or doing any of the subtle, constant work that most people do when they move through social spaces. He was simply there, completely, moving through a room at a party as if the room and the party and the people in it were all exactly as interesting as anything else in the world, and therefore worthy of the same full attention he gave everything. He was 20 feet from Sonny Liston when Liston's body registered something. The moment Liston's body knew before his mind did. Sonny Liston had the most accurate threat assessment system in professional boxing. 40 years of hard experience had calibrated it to a precision that no training manual could replicate. He could read a room the way a general reads a battlefield. He always knew where the exits were. He always knew who in a space had genuine capability and who was performing it. He always knew, within seconds of someone entering his vicinity, whether they represented anything that required his attention. This system had served him perfectly for 40 years. It had never malfunctioned. It had never produced a false positive or a false negative that he could identify. It did something unusual when Bruce Lee was 20 feet away, moving through a crowd. It activated. Not the alarm, not the full response. Something earlier than that, the first signal, the one that says, pay attention to this, before the conscious mind has anything to work with. Liston felt it, recognized it as the signal he had learned to trust above everything else. Looked up from his drink, saw Bruce Lee, saw a man who was 5'7", 140 pounds, moving through a room at a party, not looking at him, not aware of him, not doing anything except existing in that particular way of his that was entirely its own thing. Liston's conscious mind said, this doesn't make sense. The signal doesn't match the input. His body said, pay attention anyway. He watched, for maybe 15 seconds, while Bruce Lee moved through the room and came closer without knowing or intending to. And then Bruce Lee walked past, close enough that Liston could have reached out and touched him. Not looking at him, moving on, going somewhere else with the easy directional clarity of someone who always knows where they are going. And in the moment of passing, in those 2 or 3 seconds of proximity, Liston's system delivered a final assessment. That was when he grabbed his manager's arm. If you love Bruce Lee stories, subscribe. I post rare stories every day. The 3 words. His manager felt the grip on his arm and looked at Liston immediately, because the grip was not casual. It was the grip of someone communicating urgency through physical contact rather than through words. Liston was still watching Bruce Lee, who had moved past them now, who was somewhere else in the room, who had no idea this was happening. Liston said 3 words, quietly, not to the room, to his manager, in the voice of a man who is reporting something rather than performing it. He said, "Who is that?" Not a question, a statement shaped like a question, the phrasing of someone who needs information immediately and cannot wait for the social convention of the question mark. His manager looked, saw Bruce Lee moving through the room, said the name. Liston was quiet for a moment. His manager asked what was wrong. Liston said nothing for several more seconds, still watching, still tracking Bruce Lee through the room with the specific attention of a man whose assessment system was still processing something it had flagged as requiring resolution. Then he said, even more quietly, "He's real." 2 words after the first 3, 5 words total. But the ones that spread through the boxing community when the story got out were the first 3. Because the people in that world who heard the story understood immediately what those 3 words meant coming from that man, Sonny Liston, who had never grabbed anyone's arm at an event and asked who someone was, who had never looked at another person in a social setting with the focused, tracking attention he gave opponents in a ring. He had done both of those things watching a man walk past him who hadn't even looked at him. What when they were introduced? Liston told his manager to arrange an introduction, which was also unusual. Liston did not generally seek out introductions. People came to him, or they didn't, and either way was fine. The introduction was arranged, simple, names exchanged, handshake. Bruce Lee shook Sonny Liston's hand with the warmth and directness he brought to every handshake. Completely present, genuinely interested. No performance of anything. Liston shook it and felt what several other people had described feeling in that specific experience. The quality of a hand that was entirely awake, entirely engaged, no part of it on standby. He held it a fraction longer than a normal handshake, not to make a point, because he was still gathering information. Then he said, "I've heard about you." Bruce Lee said he had heard about Sonny Liston too. Said it warmly, without flattery, just acknowledgement. Liston said, "What I heard doesn't do it." Bruce Lee looked at him. Liston said, "Whatever they've been saying about you, it doesn't capture it. I could feel you from 20 feet in a crowded room. That is not a thing that happens." Bruce Lee said, "It happens when someone is paying full attention." Liston said, "I pay full attention to everything." Bruce Lee said, "I know, I felt that too." Liston looked at him for a long moment, then said something that his manager had never heard him say in 20 years. He said, "I would not want to fight you." Would not want to fight you means from Sonny Liston. The manager who witnessed this exchange spent years thinking about what Liston meant when he said those words. Not because they were unclear, because they were so specific. And because of who said them. Sonny Liston had fought people who were larger than him, faster than him, more technically skilled than him in specific areas. He had never expressed reluctance about any of them. He had expressed confidence, sometimes genuine, sometimes performed, but never reluctance. He was not saying he thought he would lose. He might have thought that. The manager was never sure. But that was not what the words meant. The manager finally arrived at an explanation that he shared in a conversation decades later. He said, "Sonny had a specific kind of courage, the courage of someone who had been through enough that he genuinely did not fear pain or loss or humiliation the way normal people did. He had absorbed enough of all of those things that they had lost their power over him." He paused. What I think he felt standing next to Bruce Lee was something his courage had no category for. Not danger in the normal sense, not the threat of being hurt or beaten. Something more fundamental. The feeling of encountering someone who was so completely themselves, so entirely without the normal human distance between the person and what they were capable of, that his entire system of understanding threat and capability and danger simply did not apply. He looked at his hands. Sonny could fight anything he understood. What he said to Bruce Lee was, "This I do not understand." And fighting what you do not understand is not courage. It is just confusion with consequences. If you love Bruce Lee stories, subscribe. I post rare stories every day. The conversation that followed, and what Liston said privately, they talked for nearly an hour, Liston and Bruce Lee, in that same spot near the back of the room. The manager stayed close but gave them space, which was also unusual. Liston generally wanted him near. That evening, he waved him back. He wanted this conversation without a witness he had not chosen. What they discussed was not fully recorded. The manager caught fragments. Others nearby caught fragments. Together they add up to an incomplete but suggestive picture of 2 men who had each arrived at the far edge of their respective disciplines, talking about what they found there. Liston talked about something he rarely discussed publicly. The experience in the ring of the best fights, not the easy ones, but the genuinely hard ones, when everything he had was fully engaged and he was operating at the absolute limit of his capability. He described a quality of clarity in those moments, of everything unnecessary falling away, of being reduced to something essential and functional that had no room for fear or doubt or the normal noise of consciousness. Bruce Lee, according to one person who heard part of the exchange, said, "That is the place. That is what it is all for." Every hour of training is trying to make that place available not just in the extreme moment, but in every moment. Liston was quiet for a bit after that, then said, "I've only been there a few times, in the hardest fights." Bruce Lee said, "I live there." Liston looked at him. Bruce Lee said, "Not all the time, but closer to all the time than to sometimes. That is what the training is, not technique, proximity to that place." Liston nodded slowly, the nod of a man confirming something he had suspected and is now hearing confirmed. He said, "That's what I felt when you walked past. Not danger. That place. I recognized it from the outside. The climax. What Liston said driving home." The event ended. They left. In the car driving home, Liston was quiet for a long time. The manager had learned not to fill Liston's silences. They meant something was processing that did not benefit from interruption. After about 20 minutes, Liston said something. He said, "I have been in this sport my whole life. I have been the hardest thing in every room I entered for 20 years. I built that. I earned that. It is real." His manager said nothing. Liston said, "That man tonight, he is not hard. Hard is something you build to protect something. He is not protecting anything. There is nothing to get through to get to him because there is no outside. It is all him, all the way down." He looked out the window. "Hard breaks," he said. "What he is doesn't break. You can't break water. You can't hurt water by hitting it. It just moves around what hits it and comes back." He shook his head slowly. "I have spent my whole career being the hardest thing in the room. I stood next to him tonight, and I understood for the first time that hard is not the top of the scale. It is just a high point on the wrong scale." The manager drove, did not speak. Liston said one more thing. The last thing he said that evening about Bruce Lee. He said, "I want to know what scale he is on, because whatever it is, I have been training for it my whole life without knowing it existed." The moral hit: hard versus water. Sonny Liston built himself into the hardest thing in every room he entered, and it worked. For 20 years it worked extraordinarily well. It won him a championship. It made him one of the most feared men in the history of his sport. It kept him standing when things that would have broken other men tried to break him. But hardness has a limit. A very specific limit that Liston identified with unusual precision in the back of a car driving home from a boxing event. Hard is something you build to protect something. It is a response to vulnerability, a solution to the problem of being breakable. And the solution works, until you encounter something that does not operate on the same terms. Something that cannot be intimidated by hardness because it has no interest in hardness at all. Something that moves around hardness the way water moves around stone. Not defeating it, not even engaging with it, just continuing, present, available, unreachable by the specific thing hardness was built to defeat. Bruce Lee had not built hardness. He had dissolved the thing that hardness was protecting. He had done the longer, stranger, less visible work of removing the distance between himself and everything he was capable of, until there was nothing left to protect, which meant there was nothing to attack. You can hit a wall. You cannot hit the absence of a wall. You can break something hard. You cannot break something that has no structure to fracture. Sonny Liston felt that in 20 feet of crowded room, felt it before he saw who was producing it. His 40-year-old threat assessment system delivered a verdict it had never delivered before. This is a different scale. The question this story leaves is not about fighting. It is about which scale you are building on. Whether the strength you are developing is the hardness that protects something, which works until it meets water, or the water itself. One of them can be broken. The other one just keeps moving.